Sometime in the spring of 1862, with the Army of Northern Virginia barely 2 weeks old under its new commander, a question moved quietly through the Confederate officer corps. Robert E. Lee had just taken command. Joseph Johnston was wounded and gone. Jefferson Davis needed someone, and the men around him had opinions about who that someone should be. Thomas Jackson had an opinion too. He went to Davis, or sent word to Davis, and what he said was this: Lee was the right man, not himself, not anyone else. Lee. That moment has lived in the margin of Civil War history for 160 years, mentioned in footnotes, cited in biographies, passed over quickly in favor of more dramatic material. But sit with it for a moment. Jackson, in the spring of 1862, was the most celebrated general in the Confederacy. His Shenandoah Valley campaign had just tied down 3 separate Union forces, kept reinforcements away from McClellan's advance on Richmond, and made his name known from the Virginia mountains to the editorial pages of London. He was not a man without ambition. He was not a man who lacked confidence in his own judgment. And he looked at Robert E. Lee and said, "That one, follow that one." That is where this story begins. Not at Chancellorsville on the night of May 2nd, 1863, though we will get there. Not with the 12-mile march that has been called the most audacious flanking movement in the history of North American warfare. Not with the friendly fire volley that tore through Jackson and his staff in the Carolina pine thicket and set in motion everything that followed. It begins with the simple, documented fact that Thomas Jackson believed in Robert E. Lee before almost anyone else did, believed in him with a completeness that expressed itself not in letters or speeches or private diaries, but in action, in obedience, in a willingness to put 28,000 men and his own life at the end of a plan that Lee had conceived and Jackson had chosen to trust. What Jackson truly thought of Robert E. Lee is not a story of bitterness. It is not a story of disillusionment or betrayal or a private verdict delivered after the war to men who would remember it. It is a harder story than that. It is a story about the rarest kind of professional faith, the kind that doesn't ask for explanations, doesn't demand reassurance, and doesn't flinch at risk, and about what that faith cost the man who carried it to the end. If that kind of history lands for you, hit like and subscribe. It helps keep this channel going. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was born on January 21, 1824 in Clarksburg, Virginia, in what is now West Virginia. He was orphaned early. His father died of typhoid fever when Thomas was 2 years old. His mother remarried, could not keep the children, and died of complications following childbirth when Thomas was 7. He was raised by an uncle, Cummins Jackson, on a farm in the Virginia hills. Whatever Jackson became, the peculiar, brilliant, deeply strange general who would unnerve both his enemies and his own subordinates, it was shaped by that early experience of loss and the specific hardness that comes from being left to build yourself out of whatever material is at hand. He got himself to West Point through persistence rather than connection. He arrived underprepared, struggled in the early months, and then began to climb. His classmates noted that if the course had run another year, he might have finished first. He graduated 17th out of 59 in the class of 1846. His roommate, George McClellan, finished second. The man he would face across the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg 16 years later, Ambrose Burnside, was in the same class. He went from West Point directly to Mexico, and in Mexico he found what his training had promised him, the confirmation that he could function under fire with a composure that other men found almost disturbing in its completeness. He was brevetted 3 times for gallantry. He came home from the war a captain with a reputation that exceeded his rank and with a clear sense of what he was suited for. What he was not suited for, as it turned out, was peace. He took a professorship at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington in 1851, teaching artillery tactics and natural philosophy. He was, by consistent account, one of the worst teachers VMI had ever seen. He memorized his lectures and delivered them verbatim, night after night, with no capacity for adaptation when a student failed to follow. He could not improvise in a classroom. He lacked entirely the ability to explain what he understood instinctively. His cadets mocked him. Some petitioned to have him removed. He stayed for a decade. What those cadets could not see, what almost no one around him in Lexington could see, was the interior life that ran beneath the awkward surface. Jackson was a man of ferocious discipline, most of it self-imposed and most of it religious. He had converted to Presbyterianism in the early 1850s and absorbed its Calvinist framework with a literalness that shaped everything. He believed in providence, not as a comfort or a metaphor, but as an operational reality. What happened in battle happened because God had ordained it. The outcome of a campaign was not a matter of tactics alone. It was the expression of a divine will that Jackson spent considerable private energy trying to read and align himself with. That belief did the same thing for Jackson that it does for certain kinds of soldiers across history. It removed fear. Not recklessness. Jackson was not reckless. He was precise, deliberate, and ruthless about detail in ways that exhausted his staff. But the question of personal survival, the question of whether he would come home from a given engagement, was not one that Jackson carried into battle the way other men did. He had placed that question in God's hands and left it there. It was, by every account of men who served with him, a quality that communicated itself to the soldiers under his command, without any words being required. He also had, by the time Virginia seceded in April 1861, a second wife he loved with a completeness that contradicts everything the battlefield record suggests about his emotional range. Mary Anna Morrison Jackson, whom he called Anna, received letters from him throughout the war that are among the most tender in the entire archive of Civil War correspondence. He called her his esposita, his little wife. He wrote about domestic details, the garden, the cat, the house they would return to, with the precision he brought to operational planning. He was, in the private record, two entirely different men. The cold, secretive, almost supernaturally composed battlefield commander, and the man who wrote to Anna about sunshine and home with the unguarded warmth of someone who had lost too much too early to take what remained for granted. Their daughter Julia was born in November 1862. Jackson saw her once, in April of 1863. 3 weeks later, he was at Chancellorsville. Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1, 1862. The army he inherited was demoralized, positioned defensively outside Richmond, and widely expected by the Northern press to fold within weeks. McClellan's Army of the Potomac, more than 100,000 men, well supplied and well organized, was within sight of the Confederate capital. Lee looked at that situation and decided to attack. The 7 days battles, Mechanicsville, Gaines' Mill, Savage's Station, White Oak Swamp, Malvern Hill, ran from June 25 to July 1, 1862. They were Lee's first major offensive operation and the first sustained test of whether the partnership he was building with his corps commanders would function under pressure. The results were, by any objective standard, mixed. Lee's operational concept was sound: strike McClellan's flank, disrupt his supply lines, drive him away from Richmond. The execution was ragged. Coordination between units broke down. Opportunities were missed. And Jackson was at the center of the failures. At Mechanicsville on June 26th, his corps arrived late. At Beaver Dam Creek, he did not engage when engagement was needed. At Gaines' Mill, he was slow. At White Oak Swamp on June 30th, he was effectively absent, sitting within earshot of a battle that needed him while his men rested on the south bank of the swamp. The explanations historians have offered are various. The physical exhaustion following the Valley Campaign, in which his corps had marched hundreds of miles in weeks, unfamiliar terrain without adequate maps, poor communication between his staff and Lee's headquarters, possible illness. None of these explanations is definitively established. None of them can be dismissed. What is documented is what Lee did not do. He did not rebuke Jackson in writing. He did not relieve him. He did not bring formal charges or convene an inquiry. He reorganized, absorbed the operational cost, and continued. And Jackson left no record of how he understood his own performance in those days. No letter to Anna trying to work through what had gone wrong. No diary entry. No staff account of private anguish or private excuse. The silence is complete, and it says something, though exactly what it says is harder to determine than the silence itself. What followed the 7 days tells you more about the Lee-Jackson relationship than the 7 days themselves. because after that uneven beginning, Lee gave Jackson the kind of assignment that a commander gives to a general he trusts completely. He sent him north to deal with John Pope. The Second Bull Run campaign, August 1862, was a different Jackson entirely. He marched his corps 54 miles in 2 days, captured Pope's supply depot at Manassas Junction, then held the line of the unfinished railroad cut at Groveton for 2 full days against repeated Union assaults, absorbing enormous punishment, fixing Pope's attention while Longstreet's corps came up on the flank. The timing required coordination across 20 miles of Virginia countryside with Civil War-era communication. It required Jackson to hold, not attack, for longer than his instincts preferred. It required trust that Longstreet was coming. Longstreet came, the Union Army broke, Pope was relieved. The pattern that would define the next 12 months was now established. Lee conceived the audacious plan, Jackson executed it with an obedience so total it bordered on the extraordinary, and the combination produced results that neither man could have produced independently. The question of what Jackson privately thought of the man who gave him these plans is, during this period, almost impossible to separate from the record of what he did with them. He followed. He followed at speed, at risk, at cost to his men and to himself, and he followed without demanding explanations that Lee did not choose to give. Among the staff accounts from this period is the attribution that has survived in the historical record as the clearest verbal evidence of how Jackson regarded Lee. Reportedly told to fellow officers or to members of his own staff during the campaigns of 1862, "It is this, he is the only man I would follow blindfolded." James I. Robertson Jr., whose 1997 biography of Jackson remains the definitive scholarly account, cites this as an authentic expression of Jackson's view, though it survives through second-hand attribution rather than a document in Jackson's hand. Treat it as credible, not verified, but also recognize what it captures about the relationship's essential quality, not admiration between equals, not friendship in any conventional sense. Something more specific and more complete. The judgment of a man who had looked at every superior he had ever served under, and found in this one, finally, someone whose operational mind he trusted more than his own. That is not a small thing. Jackson's operational mind had just run the most celebrated independent campaign of the entire war. He knew what he was capable of, and he still said, "Follow that one blindfolded." By the winter of 1862, Jackson was a lieutenant general commanding the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. He had under him, at various points, some of the most capable division commanders in the Confederate Army: A.P. Hill, Jubal Early, D.H. Hill, Richard Ewell. His relationship with several of them was difficult in the specific way that Jackson's relationships with subordinates tended to be difficult. He told them almost nothing, expected everything, and when they failed to meet his standards, he filed charges with a relentlessness that his superiors found as uncomfortable as his subordinates did. A.P. Hill was under arrest by Jackson's order in September 1862. The dispute had begun in the march north from the valley and had calcified into something personal. Jackson accused Hill of allowing his men to straggle. Hill accused Jackson of arbitrary and unreasonable command. The correspondence between them during this period is a document of two men who genuinely despised each other, expressing that despising in the formalized language of military protocol, which makes it more rather than less painful to read. Lee managed this the way he managed most internal conflict within his army, by declining to resolve it formally. He let it sit, he filed it, he continued using both men. Jackson did not complain about Lee's handling of the Hill dispute. He submitted his paperwork and continued. At Fredericksburg in December 1862, Jackson commanded the Confederate right, holding the ground along the railroad south of the town. A gap in his line, a marshy area his division commanders had considered impassable, was found and briefly penetrated by Meade's Pennsylvania division. Confederate reserves sealed the breach. The right held. The battle was a Confederate victory of such completeness that Lee, watching from the heights above Fredericksburg as wave after wave of Union infantry was shattered against Mary's Heights, reportedly said something that has since become one of the war's most quoted lines. "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it." Jackson, in his own letters from this period, wrote about the battle in the same register in which he wrote about everything military, through the lens of God's will, God's timing, God's provision. A Union breakthrough repelled was not a near disaster narrowly avoided. It was Providence operating as Providence does. This was not performance. It was how Jackson actually processed events, and it is one of the reasons his private correspondence contains so little of what a modern reader would recognize as self-analysis. Jackson did not need to interrogate his own decisions because he had placed his decisions inside a framework that was larger than any individual judgment. What that framework could not do, what nothing could do, was make him less secretive with the men who served under him. He planned in his own head. He shared almost nothing in advance. He expected his subordinates to move when ordered and ask questions afterward, by which point the answers were usually irrelevant because the operation was either over or irrecoverable. Men who served under him found this maddening. Men who served alongside him, Longstreet, most notably, found it less maddening because they encountered it horizontally rather than from below. Longstreet later wrote, in the memoir he published after the war, that Jackson had two modes in the field, an almost trance-like stillness when he was observing and a compressed, urgent intensity when he was moving. He sucked lemons. He rode a small, unremarkable horse he called Little Sorrel. He wore his VMI cap pulled so far down over his eyes that men around him sometimes could not tell where he was looking. He held his right hand raised at the wrist when he was anxious about a battle, an odd habit that his staff eventually stopped remarking on because they saw it so often. None of this was performance either. The lemon sucking, the cap, the raised hand, these were the external evidence of a man living almost entirely inside his own operational mind, trusting God with the things God controlled and controlling everything else himself. The one exception, the one place where he did not trust himself more than he trusted anyone else, was Lee. By the spring of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia had survived 2 years of war and was, in a specific and painful sense, beginning to show the cost. The men were thinner, the horses were fewer. The Confederate manufacturing and supply system that was always insufficient was becoming dangerously so. Lee's army had won battles at Second Manassas and Fredericksburg that the Confederacy could not truly afford, because the victories consumed men and materiel that could not be replaced at anything like the rate they were being spent. Joseph Hooker had replaced Burnside in command of the Army of the Potomac and had spent the winter rebuilding it. By late April 1863, Hooker had approximately 133,000 men, well supplied and considerably better organized than the force that had broken itself at Fredericksburg. Lee had approximately 60,000. What Hooker did was sophisticated. He split his force. He sent a corps under Sedgwick to demonstrate against Lee's position at Fredericksburg, holding Lee's attention on the river, while the bulk of his army crossed the Rappahannock upstream and came around Lee's left flank through the tangled second-growth forest the locals called the Wilderness. By May 1st, Hooker had his main body concentrated near a crossroads called Chancellorsville, several miles inside Lee's left flank. On paper, Lee was about to be enveloped. Lee consulted with Jackson that evening. What passed between them during those discussions is documented in the accounts of staff officers who were present, though the specific words vary by source. What is documented is the conclusion. Lee would leave a small force holding the Fredericksburg line against Sedgwick, and Jackson would take approximately 28,000 men on a march around the Union right flank, a flank that Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart had confirmed was unsupported, hanging in the air, exposed. The march would cover roughly 12 miles through forest that would have to be navigated on roads the army barely knew, in full daylight, within potential sight and hearing of the Union forces they were moving around. If Hooker discovered what was happening before Jackson was in position, the flanking column could be cut off, attacked in the flank itself, and destroyed. The force holding the Fredericksburg line would then be facing the full weight of Hooker's army with nowhere near enough men to stop it. It was among the most dangerous operational decisions Lee ever made. Jackson never hesitated. He set out before dawn on May 2nd. The march took most of the day. Union infantry spotted the column moving through gaps in the trees and reported what they saw, but Hooker convinced himself Jackson was retreating rather than flanking. The march continued. By late afternoon, Jackson's corps was in position on the right and rear of the Union XI Corps. The attack went in at approximately 5:15 in the evening. The XI Corps, mostly German immigrants who had been told by their commanders that the reports of a Confederate force to their west were exaggerated, was overrun in less than an hour. The corps collapsed westward, pushing back through Hooker's army in a chaos of abandoned artillery and running men. Jackson drove the pursuit until darkness made it impossible to continue, and then, unsatisfied with the ground gained and wanting to press further before Hooker could reorganize, he rode forward with his staff to reconnoiter. He was returning along the mountain road when the 18th North Carolina Infantry, strung across the road in the darkness and expecting a Union cavalry probe, opened fire. 3 bullets hit him, 2 in the left arm, 1 in the right hand. He did not immediately fall from his horse. His staff caught him, cut away from the road, and got him behind the Confederate lines. The arm was amputated that night by Dr. Hunter McGuire. The operation went well. The prognosis, in the hours immediately following, was cautiously optimistic. When Lee received the report of Jackson's wounding the following morning, still in the middle of managing the battle's second day, he sent a message back to the field hospital that has survived in multiple accounts, with the same emotional core in each of them. "He has lost his left arm," Lee wrote, "but I have lost my right arm." Jackson was moved, over the following days, to a plantation near Guinea Station to recover from the amputation. What no one yet knew was that during one of the transfers, a jolting ride on a stretcher in the cold night air, he had been put down hard, dropping onto his injured side. He developed pneumonia. By May 7th, it was clear the pneumonia was winning. He asked for Anna. She came with the baby. He saw Julia for the second and final time. On May 10, 1863, at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, Thomas Jackson died. His last documented words, recorded by Hunter McGuire, who was in the room, were these: "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." He said nothing in those final days about the campaign, nothing about the flank march, nothing about the men who had shot him, nothing about Lee. His requests were for Anna, for the baby, and for God. The military mind that had run the most successful corps in the Army of Northern Virginia shut itself down quietly in the same way it had always operated, without explaining itself to anyone. Here is the problem at the center of this story, and it is an honest problem rather than a dramatic convenience. The documentary record of what Thomas Jackson truly thought of Robert E. Lee is thin, not because the relationship was thin. The relationship was arguably the most consequential professional partnership in the entire Confederate military, but because Jackson was constitutionally incapable of the kind of retrospective self-disclosure that produces a documentary record. He did not write about colleagues in analytical terms. He did not evaluate his superiors in his letters to Anna. He processed military events through the framework of providence and then moved on to the next operation without pausing to record his impressions for the benefit of future historians. Lee, by contrast, left substantial evidence. His letters, his dispatches, his post-war remarks to former subordinates, all of them returned to Jackson with a grief and an admiration that are among the most consistent emotional notes in Lee's entire surviving record. After Chancellorsville, when people asked Lee about the victory, he gave credit to Jackson with a directness that was unusual for him. "The movement," Lee said, "was planned and executed by General Jackson." He did not say, "I planned it and Jackson executed it." He gave Jackson the operation entire. After Jackson died, Lee named one of the cats at his headquarters Stonewall. He referred to Jackson in conversation for the rest of his life with a tone that former staff officers consistently described as unlike anything else in Lee's emotional register. a kind of permanent, unprocessed mourning. What Jackson thought of Lee is recoverable only through the indirect evidence of what Jackson did, and through the handful of attributed statements that survive in second-hand accounts. The most credible of these, the blindfolded quote, captures something real about the relationship even at one remove from certainty. Jackson followed Lee on operations where the margin for error was measured in hours and the cost of failure was the destruction of the army. He followed across the Blue Ridge in September 1862, into Maryland, around Pope's Flank at Manassas, through the wilderness to Hooker's exposed right. He followed without demanding full explanations of how each phase of the plan would develop. He followed with a completeness and a speed that communicated, through action rather than words, the degree to which he had assessed Lee and found him worthy of that trust. There is a harder dimension to this story that the documentary record pushes toward without fully settling. Jackson was most effective when executing a plan whose operational concept someone else had set. The Valley Campaign, the achievement that made his name, was conducted within a strategic framework established by Lee and Johnston. His independent performance in the 7 days, when coordination required him to do something other than drive straight ahead with maximum speed, was the worst stretch of his entire military career. The historians who have argued that Jackson was an executor rather than a planner, that his genius was not strategic in the full sense, but operational, the genius of translating an audacious concept into an unstoppable march, are not dismissing him. They are describing the specific shape of what he was, and what he was fit Lee's requirements precisely. Lee was the planner, Jackson was the executioner. The partnership worked because each man brought what the other could not supply, and because Jackson understood this clearly enough that when he said he would follow Lee blindfolded, he may have been saying something more precise than it sounds at first. He was not flattering a superior. He was stating an operational judgment that inside Lee's plans, he knew where to go and how fast to get there, and that was all he needed to know. The gap between Lee's documented grief and Jackson's documented trust, Lee left it in words, Jackson left it in marches, is itself the shape of what they were to each other. One man lost his right arm. The other man never said, in writing, what Lee meant to him. He just did what the plan required, 12 miles through a Virginia forest, 28,000 men at his back, the whole Union right flank at the end of it. He was not a man who needed to say things out loud to mean them. On April 10, 1863, 3 weeks before Chancellorsville, Jackson rode to a plantation near the Rappahannock River where Anna had come to visit with the baby. He held Julia for the first time. She was 5 months old. He spent several days there, the only sustained period of domestic life he had known since the war began, and by the accounts of those present, it was not restful in the conventional sense, but something more intense and more private. A man storing something up, though he would not have described it that way. He returned to his corps on April 15th. The Chancellorsville campaign began on April 30th. He never came home. What the faith cost Jackson is clearest when you look at May 2nd from his perspective, rather than from the perspective of the history books that have made the flank march into a set piece of tactical brilliance. He was 53 miles inside a forest, in the dark, with 28,000 men who had just overrun a Union corps and were now pressing into ground that nobody had mapped, pushing the reconnaissance forward because that was what Jackson always did. He went to the front to see for himself, because maps and reports were never as accurate as his own eyes. And it was that habit, that specific expression of the same compressed intensity that had won every battle he had fought under Lee. That put him on the mountain road when the 18th North Carolina opened fire. The flank march killed him, not the enemy, not a Union bullet, the very act that most completely expressed his trust in Lee's operational judgment, the march itself. The willingness to accept every risk the plan required put him in the position, at the end of it, where his own men shot him in the dark. The historical irony of this has been noted by every biographer. It has not been exhausted. Lee won at Chancellorsville. It is considered his greatest victory, a smaller force defeating a larger one through audacity, timing, and the specific partnership between a planner and an executor that never functioned quite the same way again. The Army of Northern Virginia went on to Gettysburg 6 weeks later, and what happened at Gettysburg is, in the view of many historians, partly a function of what was missing, not just the men Jackson would have commanded. Not just the corps-level tactical instinct that A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell, Jackson's successors, could not fully replicate, but the specific relationship, the trust that did not require explanation, the faith that did not need to be articulated, between the man who made the plans and the man who followed them. Jackson never got the chance to fail Lee the way Lee's other subordinates failed him. He never stood at Cemetery Ridge watching a plan go wrong. He never held a position he should have taken or failed to arrive at an hour when his arrival would have changed everything. He left the partnership at its apex, at the moment when the evidence for what he thought of Lee was most unambiguous. He had just marched 12 miles through a Virginia forest, in full confidence of the concept, and shattered the Union right. He thought Lee was worth following. He thought it completely enough that he followed without reservation and died in the act of following. History gave Lee the victory. Jackson gave Lee everything else. That is not sentiment talking. That is the record read straight.